Welcome to the Worldview Bulletin, where we explore faith, culture, and ideas through the lens of the Christian worldview. What if suffering is real but not ultimate? J.R.R. Tolkien coined the word Eucatastrophe to describe the sudden and unexpected turn from darkness toward joy. In this video, Thiago Silva explores how Tolkien's literary insight illuminates the Christian story, especially the cross and resurrection, and gives believers a hope that neither denies suffering nor surrenders to despair.
We live in a cultural moment that has learned to distrust hope. Optimism is often dismissed as naive, joy is treated as denial, and realism is increasingly defined by cynicism. Stories that end in despair are praised as honest, while stories that end in redemption are accused of being sentimental. Beneath all of this is an unspoken assumption that suffering is the deepest truth of the world, and that anything which challenges that assumption must be an illusion. And yet Christianity has always insisted on telling a very different story, one that takes suffering seriously without granting it ultimate authority. The Christian faith claims that the world is broken, but not meaningless, that evil is real, but not sovereign, and that history is not drifting toward tragedy, but toward redemption. J.R.R. Tolkien gave a name to this vision through his idea of eucatastrophe, a word that helps us see more clearly not only the shape of great stories, but the shape of Christian hope itself. Tolkien coined the word eucatastrophe to describe the sudden, unexpected turn toward joy that occurs at the darkest moment of a story. And the more carefully we attend to what he meant, the more we realize that he was not merely talking about literature, but about reality itself. The word joins catastrophe, a turn toward disaster, with the prefix "eu," meaning good. Yet this goodness does not cancel the catastrophe that precedes it. A eucatastrophe is not a clever escape hatch or a narrative shortcut. The danger was real. The loss mattered. The sorrow was not imagined or exaggerated. And yet, precisely when everything seems beyond repair, hope breaks in, not as something forced or sentimental, but as something fitting and deeply true. The joy feels undeserved, even shocking, and that is precisely why it rings with authenticity rather than artifice. In his 1947 essay on fairy stories, Tolkien wrote, "I would venture to say that all complete fairy stories must have a happy ending. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function." This is why eucatastrophe feels fundamentally different from sentimentality. Sentimentality refuses to look suffering in the eye. It smooths the rough edges, minimizes the cost, and rushes toward comfort. Eucatastrophe does the opposite. It lingers in the darkness long enough for the reader to feel its weight. It allows fear, grief, and failure to have their full force. Only then does joy arrive, not as denial, but as transformation. Tolkien believed that stories shaped this way resonate so deeply because they align with something true about the world, something we sense intuitively even when we struggle to articulate it. The human heart longs for joy, but not cheap joy. It longs for a joy that has passed through sorrow and emerged on the other side. This conviction explains why Tolkien rejected the charge that fantasy is escapist. He argued that escape is only a vice if the prison is legitimate. If despair, meaninglessness, and inevitability truly define reality, then hope would indeed be a form of delusion. But Tolkien believed the opposite. He believed that modern cynicism mistakes exhaustion for wisdom and resignation for realism. In that sense, fantasy does not flee reality, it recovers it. It trains our vision to see that the world is more than what is immediately visible, that the deepest truths are not always the most obvious ones, and that darkness does not exhaust the meaning of existence. Eucatastrophe, then, names a form of realism that is deeper than cynicism. Cynicism assumes that disappointment is the final word and that hope is merely emotional self-defense. Eucatastrophe insists that hope is woven into the fabric of reality itself, not as an illusion, but as a promise. It acknowledges darkness fully, without flinching, while refusing to grant it ultimate authority. And it is precisely at this point that Tolkien's literary insight opens naturally into theology, because Christianity has always claimed that the world is not finally tragic, even though it is deeply broken. This movement from literary realism to theological truth leads us naturally to Scripture, because the Bible tells a story shaped not by uninterrupted progress, but by repeated collapse and unexpected grace. In other words, the biblical story does not merely resemble eucatastrophe, it is eucatastrophic at its core. When we turn from Tolkien's stories to the story Scripture tells, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The Bible is not a narrative of steady improvement or human ascent. It is a story marked by fracture, failure, and interruption. Creation gives way to the fall, promise gives way to rebellion, covenant gives way to exile. Again and again, God's purposes appear to be unraveling under the weight of human sin and entrenched evil. The people chosen to bless the world repeatedly mirror the world's brokenness instead. From a purely human perspective, the story seems to be moving toward collapse rather than fulfillment. And yet, at precisely those moments when the story appears most endangered, grace interrupts judgment. A remnant survives. A promise is renewed. A word from God breaks long silence. Hope reappears, not as human achievement, but as divine gift. This pattern reaches its deepest and most unsettling expression in the cross of Jesus Christ. From every visible angle, the crucifixion is a complete disaster. The Messiah is rejected by his own people. Justice fails under political pressure. Innocence is condemned. God appears silent. The disciples scatter in fear and confusion. Christianity does not soften this moment, and it must not. The cross is not a misunderstanding, nor is it merely symbolic. It is real defeat, real suffering, real darkness. If the story ends on Good Friday, Christian faith collapses entirely. There is no message left to proclaim, no hope left to offer, no redemption left to expect. Yet precisely because the catastrophe is real, the resurrection becomes something far greater than consolation or reversal. Easter does not erase Good Friday, it answers it. Jesus does not rise as though nothing happened. He rises bearing wounds. Death is defeated but not denied. The scars remain, now transformed from signs of shame into marks of victory. Tolkien famously described the resurrection as the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation, the sudden and overwhelming joy that erupts from the deepest possible darkness. The joy of Easter is not cheap because it is purchased at the highest possible cost. This is why Christian hope is categorically different from cultural optimism. Optimism depends on favorable circumstances, upward trends, or manageable risks. It collapses when conditions deteriorate. Christian hope, by contrast, is rooted in an event that has already occurred. Christ is risen. And because of that, catastrophe no longer defines reality. Evil is real, but it is not sovereign. Death is powerful, but it is not ultimate. The resurrection announces that the worst thing is never the last thing. This eucatastrophic center of the Christian faith now reshapes everything that follows, including how believers understand their own lives, their failures, and the often confusing ways God works in the world. If the cross and resurrection form the heart of reality, then grace and providence must be understood through that same lens. Once we see the cross and resurrection as the great eucatastrophe, we begin to understand why the Christian life feels the way it does. This vision reshapes how Christians understand grace, failure, and providence, especially in a culture that equates faithfulness with success and obedience with visible results. In Tolkien's own stories, victory does not come through flawless heroism or sheer willpower. Frodo does not succeed because he finally becomes strong enough to resist the ring. He fails at the decisive moment. His strength collapses. And yet, the quest is completed through mercy shown earlier, mercy whose significance could not be seen at the time. What appeared insignificant becomes decisive. What looked like weakness becomes the means of deliverance. This mirrors the biblical truth that salvation does not come because humanity finally gets it right, but because God remains faithful when humanity fails. Grace does not merely assist human effort, it precedes it, surrounds it, and completes it. It works not only through our obedience, but often in spite of our weakness. This is deeply unsettling to modern instincts, which crave control, clarity, and measurable outcomes, yet it is precisely this unsettling grace that lies at the heart of the gospel. The same is true of providence. God's governance of the world is rarely obvious in the moment. Scripture consistently affirms that God works through delay, obscurity, and apparent defeat. Providence is not the smooth management of outcomes or the guarantee of immediate resolution. It is the faithful guidance of a story whose meaning often remains hidden until the end. Christians live between resurrection and new creation, between victory already won and redemption not yet complete. The world is saved but not yet healed. Evil is defeated, but loss remains real. Faithfulness does not always lead to visible success, and obedience is often costly without being immediately rewarding. This explains why so many believers feel weary rather than triumphant. They are not faithless. They are realistic. They live in the tension the New Testament itself describes. Eucatastrophe offers them language for a hope that does not require constant victory, a hope that does not collapse when prayers remain unanswered or when faithfulness seems unnoticed. It affirms that unseen acts of obedience matter, that mercy shown today may bear fruit long after we are gone, and that God's purposes are not frustrated by our limitations. This is not pessimism. It is theological realism shaped by resurrection hope. It allows Christians to tell the truth about suffering without surrendering to despair, to acknowledge loss without denying meaning, and to wait without assuming that waiting is wasted. Eucatastrophe teaches believers to trust that God is at work even when the story feels unresolved, and that the final joy, when it comes, will not feel artificial, but inevitable. And that ultimately is why this vision endures. It gives Christians a way to live faithfully in a broken world without pretending it is not broken, and to hope deeply without needing to see the ending yet. Eucatastrophe gives Christians a language for a hope that neither denies suffering nor surrenders to it. It reminds us that the Christian faith does not begin with optimism and then scramble to explain pain. It begins with catastrophe. It looks unflinchingly at a broken world, at human failure, at injustice, and at death itself, and still insists that none of these things are final. This is not a fragile hope dependent on circumstances or outcomes. It is a hope grounded in the character of God and anchored in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In a culture increasingly shaped by cynicism, where realism is confused with despair and faith is reduced to emotional coping, the Christian confession stands apart. It does not claim that everything will work out neatly in this life, nor does it promise visible success to the faithful. Instead, it proclaims that God is at work even when his work remains hidden, that obedience matters even when it appears fruitless, and that mercy shown in weakness may prove decisive in ways we cannot yet see. The Christian story leaves room for loss, grief, and unresolved longing, precisely because it trusts that God's purposes are larger than any single moment. This is why the cross remains central. Christianity never moves beyond Good Friday by pretending it did not happen. The risen Christ is still the crucified one. His wounds are not erased but glorified. In the same way, the final redemption promised in Scripture does not discard history, but fulfills it. What is broken is healed. What is lost is restored. What is suffered is not forgotten. The final joy of God's kingdom will not feel artificial or disconnected from the pain that preceded it. It will feel true. Eucatastrophe, then, is not merely a literary concept or a helpful metaphor. It is a window into the shape of reality as Christians confess it to be. It teaches us to live faithfully between resurrection and new creation, to endure without despair, and to hope without illusion. It gives believers permission to be honest about the darkness while remaining confident in the light. In the end, Christian hope is not the expectation that catastrophe will be avoided, but the assurance that catastrophe will be answered. The resurrection of Jesus stands as the great interruption in the story of the world, the declaration that death does not get the final word. Because of that, the Christian life is lived not in denial of suffering, but in defiance of its claim to ultimacy. The story is not over, and when the final joy comes, it will not cheapen the sorrow that came before it, it will complete it.
Today's presentation was an audio version of an article originally published at the Worldview Bulletin. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. It helps us reach more people. If you'd like to read these articles as well as listen to them, please visit worldviewbulletin.substack.com and subscribe to our weekly emails.